Hello, today I'd like to discuss Sam Adams and social justice, and in particular I want to explain why it is that I believe that Sam Adams, if he were alive today, would be more or less in favor of the 99% movement, okay, i.e. the Occupy Wall Street movement. Now, it should be noted that Sam Adams did not believe that once a republic was established that a violent movement is acceptable. Okay, he opposed Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion on that premise. Now, he differed from his own allies within Jefferson's Democratic Party on that issue. A lot of them were very much in favor of the idea of, the Tree of Liberty and the blood of patriots and that type of thing. But Sam Adams, in my opinion, very wisely stated that once a republic is established, you work through the political system. Now, the issue of a nonviolent movement is an entirely different issue. The issue of a movement based on nonviolent civil disobedience is very much of a different issue altogether, because now you are talking about the expression of the people. Now you are talking about the people standing up in a way to a very similar situation that Sam Adams himself stood up to. And that would be taxation without representation. Now, you're objecting at this point, and you're saying we do have representation, we vote for representatives. Let's look at the system of representatives that they had in the British Parliament. In the British Parliament, they had the rotten borough system. They had the corruption of the English system as it had departed from its own constitutional foundations and was eventually becoming a system whereby the very few would dominate at the top. Fundamental bedrock Whig principles as established by the Glorious Revolution were being undermined. And the Founding Fathers and the colonial patriots did not want that extended to the colonies. Least of all, Sam Adams. In essence, that is what we have today, if you really want to look at it. We have a system of taxation without real, true representation. The moneyed men, the moneyed powers buy and sell our representatives now as we speak. And this is exactly what Sam Adams could see in England. It wasn't a simple narrative of, oh, the king, and he was so bad and terrible, and we didn't want the king. That's not actually what it was in its true complexity. The truth is, what we did not want was not only the king, but the moneyed interests of England being able to essentially dominate the colonies, where we had, well, in the case of the colonies, we literally had no say in it because we had no votes in Parliament. But in the case of the English people themselves, they had the vote, but the vote wasn't able to be exercised in any kind of forthright way because of all the money that was flowing into politics, because of the rotten borough system, because of the corruption, the undermining of what the founding generation would call virtue. But what virtue meant was very much of a civic virtue. What it meant was a virtuous and free civil government. And what the early founders, once the republic was established, would call republican virtue. Okay? It's something that you could trace even as far back as the Roman Republic, when Brutus and Cicero and those people claimed to be standing up for Roman virtues. Okay? And they also did not want extremes of wealth and power, because extremes of wealth and power would corrupt, and did corrupt, the Roman Republic. It did corrupt the constitutional monarchy of England. And Adams understood the power of extreme wealth and poverty to corrupt our own republic here, and advocated what would be called, and what has been called by historians, the, quote, Christian Sparta. In other words, he hoped that the republic would be a, quote, Christian Sparta. Now, that's hardly what you could call a liberal paradise or a left-wing paradise. It should be noted that in fact, he was out of step with other founding fathers on this question of, well, it's complicated because he was religiously tolerant in his own way. So really, I don't think the term Christian Sparta should be understood in maybe the way that you might think. The idea was that just as the Greeks had a relative level of equality, they did not have a few people at the top and a few people at the bottom, where they had slaves, okay? So it's complicated. But the ideal, at least among citizens, was of a rough level of equality. Never mind who was included as a citizen for now. So the idea in America is that among citizens, there would be a rough level of equality. That did not mean that Sam Adams favored what you would later call socialism. And we're going to get into a quote that a lot of conservative-minded people will use to say that Sam Adams would be against socialism or against any kind of liberalism. And I'm going to read the quote, because it is a quote that needs to be addressed if I'm going to say that Sam Adams would be in favor of the 99%. Before I do, I want to say from the outset that I'm in general support of the Occupy Wall Street movement. I may not necessarily be in total support of any movement. I don't give my power as an individual over to any movement. So if the Occupy Wall Street movement advocates a socialist revolution in the United States, I'm not going to be in favor of that. If they advocate some kind of extreme violent revolution or something that I think would harm national security of ourselves or our allies, then no, I would not be in favor of that. Okay, so just to be clear, what I am in favor of is the idea that the 99% should organize, and I believe that Sam Adams would be in favor of the same thing. But he did say this, quote, "The utopian schemes of leveling and a community of goods are as visionary and impractical as those which vest all property in the crown, are arbitrary, despotic, and in our government unconstitutional." Okay, and that's from the House of Representatives of Massachusetts to Denis Debert from 1768, and it's written to somebody who was on the Colonial Council of Massachusetts, spelling out the arguments of the colonists that they should not be taxed without representation. Now, notice what this says. The utopian schemes of leveling a community of goods are visionary and impractical. Now, that would be the one extreme, as that which vests all property in the crown, or I would also say an elite, are arbitrary, despotic, and are our government unconstitutional. Let's give this some context. The Tories believed and would claim that with the agitation of the Patriots, that the agitation of the colonies would lead, in essence, to leveling out of all authority, that it would lead to leveling of property. Now, the Tories wanted order. They wanted a hierarchy. And the Whigs often felt that they had to respond to this argument, particularly the more conservative Whigs, who did favor, the Whigs did stake their argument on property, the rights of Englishmen, property. So they had to address that argument. They could not, particularly the more conservative Whigs, were not going to come out in favor of utopian schemes of leveling. Now note that this is written by Sam Adams on behalf of the House of Representatives of Massachusetts. That's a lot of people. So you're not going to get to the true heart of what Sam Adams would have thought by looking at a public document like this. But that's neither here nor there. It does go against utopian schemes of leveling. And what it is saying is that on the one hand, you have a kind of egalitarian utopia, which is visionary and impractical, according to them. But then on the other hand, you have a kind of hierarchical model, which is despotic. Now, you would think from the use that conservatives take of this, often libertarians will often make of this statement, that Sam Adams spent his whole time lambasting socialism or lambasting utopia. No, he did not. He spent his time lambasting the usurpations of the crown or the elite. He spent most of his time, most of his political career doing that. He did oppose the Shays Rebellion. I have to acknowledge that. He differed from a lot of his allies in that. But he was generally supportive of the initial phases of the French Revolution. Not the terror, obviously, and I certainly would agree with that. I would not be in favor of any terror. And I would obviously hope that the OWS movement would never devolve into anything like that. But I don't think that it has. I think that if you really look at this in context, what you find is that Sam Adams did not spend his political career attacking utopian schemes of leveling. Nor do I believe that utopian schemes of leveling are what the Occupy Wall Street movement necessarily are all about. Now, there are radicals in the movement, but the radicals have been unable to take over the General Assemblies. Most of the power in the General Assemblies are held by people who want some kind of action in favor of the 99%. Some kind of a vision that Sam Adams would have held of a republic predicated on power and rights for the common people. Not to have an elite being able to buy out the political process. And I'm running down on my 10 minutes, but I want to say that yes, this quote does exist, but there are a lot of websites on the web that take it out of context. Thank you very much.